She fits. You don't. End of discussion, Chief. Captain, look at her. The kid barely clears the muzzle of my 50 cal. You shove her into that ventilation shaft, she's not coming back out. It's a tomb. We are pinned down by 3 sniper nests and a heavy machine gun emplacement that we can't see. We have 2 wounded, bleeding out. That vent is the only flanking route to the upper atrium. Send Miller. He can squeeze. Miller is 6'2" with broad shoulders. He'd get stuck at the first junction. Specialist Vance is the only asset with the biometric profile for the tunnel. Silence. The sound of mortar fire thumping dully against the reinforced concrete walls outside vibrates through the floor. Specialist Vance? I'm already rigged, sir. Suppressor attached. Drag bag minimized. You know if you get compromised in there, we can't get to you? No comms, no extraction? You're a ghost. I've been invisible my whole life, Chief. Why start seeing me now? Check your fire. You have green light. Go. 14 hours earlier, Forward Operating Base, Copperhead. The locker room at Forward Operating Base Copperhead smelled of stale sweat, CLP gun oil, and aggressive testosterone. It was a scent specialist Elara Vance knew well, though she had never quite been allowed to feel part of it. She sat on a bench that was too high for her, her boots barely touching the concrete floor, methodically lacing up. At 4 feet, 11 inches, and weighing barely 95 pounds soaking wet, Elara didn't look like she belonged in the same zip code as the men around her, let alone the same tactical unit. Her face, devoid of wrinkles and framed by short-cropped hair, still held the soft roundness of youth. To the uninitiated, she looked 12. To the seasoned operators of SEAL Team 7, she was a liability wrapped in Kevlar. "Hey, Pixie!" A voice boomed from the row of lockers opposite her. "Make sure you pack your juice box. Don't want you getting cranky on the bird." Laughter rippled through the room. Low, guttural, and dismissive. Elara didn't look up. Her hands moved with mechanical precision, checking the seating of the magazine in her custom-shortened SR-25 designated marksman rifle. "Check, Miller. I packed 2. One for me, one for when you cry about the heat." "Cute," Miller grunted, sliding a plate carrier over a chest that was wider than Elara was tall. The laughter died abruptly as Master Chief Bulldog Rogan stepped into the aisle. He was a monolith of a man, scarred and weathered, with eyes that assessed human value solely on kinetic potential. He stopped in front of Elara, his shadow swallowing her whole. "Vance!" Rogan barked. "Master Chief," Elara replied, finally looking up. She kept her expression neutral, a mask she had perfected over 3 years of constant scrutiny. Rogan kicked the toe of her boot lightly. "You're heavy. That pack is 40 pounds. You weigh what? 90? 96, Chief. The infill point is 3 clicks of broken urban terrain. Rubble, rebar, climb-ups. If you lag, I leave you. I don't carry dead weight, and I definitely don't carry mascots." "I don't lag," Elara said, her voice steady, though her pulse hammered against her ribs. "We'll see," Rogan sneered. He pointed a thick finger at her rifle. "And that toy? Why aren't you running the standard MK-12? We need interchangeability." "The SR-25 is modified for a shorter length of pull and higher caliber stability for my frame," Elara recited, the technical justification automatic. "I can engage point targets at 800 meters with a 90% hit probability. The MK-12 stock is too long. I'd be fighting the weapon, not the enemy. If we get into a firefight in a hallway, that barrel length is going to get you killed," Rogan said, leaning down until he was inches from her face. You're a ballistics nerd, Vance. You belong in a lab, not on a hit. Command forced you on this roster because of your specialized skill set with structural weak points. But out there, physics doesn't care about your math. Physics favors the big. Physics favors the one who doesn't miss, Elara countered quietly. The room went dead silent. Miller stopped chewing his gum. Rogan stared at her for a long, agonizing second. Then he straightened up, a vein throbbing in his neck. Wheels up in 10. If you're not on the ramp in 5, you stay. He turned and marched out. Elara exhaled, a breath she felt she'd been holding since she woke up. She stood, hoisting the ruck onto her shoulders. The weight drove her feet into the floor, compressing her spine. It was heavy, crushing even. But she didn't grimace. She grabbed her rifle, checked the chamber one last time, and walked toward the hangar bay. The oversized plate carrier chafed her neck. The helmet felt like a bowling ball. As she passed Miller, he didn't laugh this time. He just shook his head, a look of genuine pity in his eyes. "Don't die, kid," he muttered. "Not today," Elara whispered to herself, stepping out into the blinding desert sun. They thought she was a child playing soldier. They were about to find out that size was just a variable, and Elara Vance was the one solving the equation. The MH-60 Blackhawk did not touch down. It hovered 6 feet above the loose shale of the drop zone, the rotor wash creating a localized sandstorm that whipped against Elara's goggles. One by one, the men of Alpha Platoon fast-roped into the darkness, boots hitting the ground with practiced, heavy thuds. Elara slid down last. Her boots connected with the earth, and the momentum nearly buckled her knees under the 40-pound ruck, but she absorbed the shock, dropped to one knee, and brought her SR-25 up to scan her sector. The darkness was absolute, broken only by the monochromatic green glow of her PVS-31 night vision goggles. "Move," Rogan's voice crackled in her earpiece, devoid of warmth. The platoon began the 3-kilometer hump to the target. For the SEALs, it was a tactical trot. For Specialist Elara Vance, it was a sprint. The physics of anatomy were cruel. Master Chief Rogan and Miller stood well over 6 feet. Their natural gait covered nearly a meter with every casual step. Elara, at 4'11", had to take nearly 2 steps for every one of theirs just to maintain formation. The math of the march was against her. Within the first 10 minutes, her lungs were burning, the straps of her ruck cutting into her shoulders like wire. Left, right. Don't pant. Don't drag your feet. The terrain was a graveyard of bombed-out concrete and twisted rebar. The men stepped over obstacles with ease. Elara had to scramble, climb, or jump. Every extra motion cost energy she didn't have. Sweat slicked her brow inside the helmet, stinging her eyes, but she couldn't break seal to wipe it. "Gap on the rear," Miller whispered over the comms. "Close it up, Pixie." The nickname wasn't affectionate. It was a reminder. Elara grit her teeth, forcing her burning quadriceps to fire harder. She surged forward, closing the 5-meter gap that had opened up between her and the man in front. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She knew what they were thinking. "She's weak. She's slowing us down. She doesn't belong." They moved into the outskirts of the industrial district. The silence was heavy, oppressive. The city felt empty, but Elara knew better. In urban warfare, emptiness was usually a prelude to ambush. The team approached a narrow alleyway flanked by crumbling brick walls, a natural choke point. The point man, a lanky operator named Davis, raised a fist. "Halt." He scanned the ground, his IR laser sweeping the debris. then signaled clear and moved forward. Rogan followed, then Miller. Elara watched them through the green phosphor grain of her NVGs. She was 10 meters back, low to the ground. As Davis stepped over a pile of trash, something caught Elara's eye. It wasn't on the ground where they were looking. It was at shin level, her eye level. A faint, unnatural straight line bisecting the chaotic geometry of the rubble. Usually, a tripwire is set low to catch a foot, but in this sector, they sometimes strung them higher to catch the knee of a tall soldier or the waist of a civilian, or in this case, exactly at the neck height of a child, or the eye level of a 4'11" woman. Davis had stepped right over it, his gaze focused on the rooftops. Rogan was about to walk through it. "Freeze!" Elara hissed into the comms, the command overriding protocol. The entire platoon locked up instantly, weapons snapping to the high ready. "Vance, you better have a target," Rogan's voice was a low growl in her ear. "Why did we stop?" Elara didn't answer. She moved forward, crouching low, her movements fluid despite the exhaustion. She bypassed Miller, who looked down at her with irritation, and crept toward Rogan. She reached out a gloved hand, stopping inches from his thigh, and pointed a single finger at the air 6 inches in front of his knee. Rogan adjusted his focus. Through his NVGs, he finally saw it. A strand of copper wire, thin as a hair, painted matte gray to blend with the dust. It ran from a rusted pipe to a pile of innocent-looking bricks against the wall. If Rogan had taken one more step, his shin would have snagged it. The blast radius in this confined alley would have turned the entire platoon into pink mist. Rogan froze. He traced the wire with his eyes, then looked down at Elara. She was looking up at him, her chest heaving slightly from the exertion of the hike, but her hands were perfectly steady. "EOD is 20 mics out," Elara whispered. "We can step over. 20 inches high. Careful." Rogan didn't say thank you. He simply signaled the team. One by one, the giant men stepped gingerly over the wire, their boots clearing it by inches. When it was Elara's turn, the wire was practically at her waist. She slipped under it without bending. As they reformed on the other side, Miller passed her. He tapped his helmet. "Lucky catch, kid." Elara adjusted her rifle sling. Lucky. Not skill. Not the fact that her lower vantage point allowed her to see what their towering perspective missed. Just luck. "Eyes open," Rogan commanded, his voice devoid of praise. "We're 5 mics from the objective. Pace up." The march resumed. The pain in Elara's legs returned, screaming louder than before, but the cold knot in her stomach tightened. They didn't respect her. They thought she stumbled upon survival. 10 minutes later, the silhouette of the target loomed out of the darkness. It was a massive textile factory, a brutalist concrete block with shattered windows that looked like hollow eyes staring down at them. It was silent. Too silent. Rogan signaled for the breach. As Elara took her position at the rear guard, staring up at the monolithic structure, a shiver crawled up her spine that had nothing to do with the cold desert night. The building felt like a beast waiting to be fed. "Breaching in 3, Davis whispered. Elara checked her chamber. She had saved them once tonight. She had a feeling the debt was about to accrue interest. The main floor of the textile factory was a cavernous expanse of dormant machinery. Looming weaving machines stood like iron ribs in the darkness, casting long, jagged shadows under the erratic sweep of the SEAL's IR lasers. The silence was absolute, save for the rhythmic crunch of boots on the concrete floor. "Target building secure at entry." Lieutenant Graves whispered over the net. Moving to HVT location. Room 104. Elara brought up the rear, her SR-25 tucked tight into her shoulder. The hair on her arms stood up. It was too easy. The outer perimeter had been unmanned. No sentries, no tripwires other than the one in the alley. It felt less like an infiltration and more like an invitation. They reached room 104. Davis breached the door with a fluid kick, the team flowing in like water. Clear left, Miller called out. Clear right. Elara stepped in last. The room was set up as an office, but it was barren. In the center sat a single wooden chair. On it was not a high-value terrorist leader, but a simple, cheap walkie-talkie taped to the backrest. Static hissed from the device. Then, a voice spoke in distorted Arabic. Welcome. It's a trap! Get off the X! Rogan roared, his voice breaking silence discipline. Before the order could fully register, the world turned white. High-intensity halogen floodlights, rigged along the catwalks 20 feet above, snapped on simultaneously. The sudden brilliance was blinding to men wearing light-amplifying goggles. Goggles up! Goggles up! Elara ripped her NVGs off her helmet, blinking tears from her eyes. As her vision cleared, the sound of mechanical locks slamming home echoed from the heavy steel doors they had just passed through. They were sealed in. Then the walls erupted. Machine gun fire poured from the elevated catwalks in a devastating crossfire. The air instantly filled with the supersonic cracks of 7.62 millimeter rounds impacting concrete and flesh. Contact front! Contact high! Elara dove behind a rusted industrial loom just as a line of bullets chewed up the floor where she had been standing. Because of her size, the cover offered by the machine's base was total. For the SEALs, it was barely enough. RPG! Someone screamed. The whoosh of a rocket-propelled grenade dominated the chaotic noise. It struck the center of the kill zone, detonating against a structural pillar. The concussive blast wave knocked the wind out of Elara, slamming her helmet against the floor. Dust and debris rained down like shrapnel. Through the ringing in her ears, she heard a sound worse than the explosion, the wet, gurgling cry of a man down. Man down! The LT is down! Elara peered around the edge of the loom. Lieutenant Graves lay in the open, his legs a ruin of red mist and shredded fabric. He wasn't moving. The RPG had impacted less than 3 meters from him. Covering fire! Rogan bellowed, stepping into the open with his MK-48 machine gun. He unleashed a stream of hate at the catwalks, the belt feeding rapidly into the weapon. Miller, grab the LT. We need to move. Miller lunged forward, grabbing the lieutenant's drag handle. He pulled, but Graves was dead weight, literally. A second burst of enemy fire struck the lieutenant's chest plate. Miller flinched, took a round to his shoulder pad, and scrambled back. He's gone, Chief! He's gone! Miller yelled, his voice tight with panic. Rogan didn't hesitate. In the hierarchy of combat, hesitation was death. Leave him! Alpha, on me! Fall back to the supply room at your 6. Move or die! Elara scrambled to her feet. The air was thick with pulverized concrete and cordite. She couldn't see the enemy, only the muzzle flashes sparking like fireflies in the rafters above. She raised her rifle, firing blindly toward a cluster of flashes to keep their heads down, though she knew her semi-automatic fire was a whisper against their roar. Vance, move! Rogan grabbed her by the back of her plate carrier and practically threw her toward a heavy steel door marked Supply. The team collapsed into the room, boots sliding on the dust-slicked floor. Miller and Davis provided rear security, spraying the hallway until the last man was inside. Rogan slammed the heavy iron door shut and threw the deadbolt. A second later, Bullets hammered against the other side of the door, ringing like a frantic church bell. The room fell into a terrifying, heavy-breathing silence. It was a windowless concrete box, maybe 20 by 20 feet, filled with shelving units and old crates. "Sound off," Rogan commanded, his chest heaving. "Miller, green. Took a graze to the deltoid. Davis, green. Ammo check." "Vance, green," Elara whispered, checking her limbs. She was shaking, not from fear, but from the sheer, raw intensity of the violence. Rogan walked to the center of the room. He looked at his men. They were covered in white dust, eyes wide in the gloom. They were alive, but they were trapped. "Sit rep," Rogan said, his voice flat. "Graves is KIA. I have command. We are cut off from the exfil point. The main hall is a kill box. Comms?" "Negative," the comms specialist, a quiet guy named Tex, shook his head. "They're jamming us. I'm getting nothing but static on SATCOM and MBITAR. So we're blind, deaf, and down a man," Rogan muttered. He looked at the heavy door. The metal was starting to deform slightly from the sustained fire outside. "And they know exactly where we are." "Chief," Elara spoke up. She was kneeling by a stack of crates, studying a faded blueprint tacked to the wall, a fire evacuation map. "This room doesn't have a rear exit. It backs up to the main ventilation exchange." Rogan looked at her. For the first time, he didn't look at her like a nuisance. He looked at her like a resource. "Meaning?" "Meaning we're in a dead end," Elara said, tracing the lines on the map. "And judging by the volume of fire out there, there's at least a company-sized element. 300, maybe more." "They don't need to breach," Miller said grimly, leaning against the wall. "They just need to wait us out, or toss a few grenades through the vents." Rogan looked around the small, suffocating room. The walls were thick, but they were a tomb. "Check your ammo," Rogan ordered. "Count every round. We're not dying in a closet." Elara looked down at her rifle. She had fired 3 rounds. She had 4 magazines left. Outside, the chanting began. Hundreds of voices echoing in the factory hall, chanting for blood. They were pinned. They were outnumbered 50-1. And the only way out was through an army. Inside the supply closet, the air was growing thin. The adrenaline that had surged during the ambush was beginning to curdle into the cold, sharp clarity of survival. Outside the heavy steel door, the gunfire had ceased, replaced by the ominous sounds of shouting and the dragging of heavy objects. They were barricading the team in. Rogan knelt by the door, listening. He turned back to the 3 surviving members of his team. In the green glow of a chemical light stick Miller had cracked, their faces were masks of grime and exhaustion. "Ammo check," Rogan ordered, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm Winchester on the MK-48, Miller grunted, tossing the empty belt link aside. "Down to 3 mags on the primary, 2 frags. "Davis, 2 mags rifle, 1 pistol mag. I lost my pack in the scramble." Rogan cursed silently. "I've got half a belt and 2 mags. We are combat ineffective in 10 minutes of sustained contact." Elara sat in the corner, her knees pulled to her chest to make herself smaller. A habit, not a tactic. She checked her own rig. "I have 4 full magazines for the SR-25, 40 rounds of match-grade hollow point, and my sidearm is full." "Great," Miller muttered, wiping blood from his graze. 40 rounds against a battalion. We can hold them off for about 30 seconds. Rogan ignored him. He moved to the walls, tapping them with the butt of his knife. Solid concrete. No windows. No back door. The map Elara had found indicated a maintenance access, but the reality of the room was starker. It was a reinforced storage locker designed to protect sensitive electronics from dust. It was now a coffin. "They're setting up a DSHK heavy machine gun down the hall," Rogan said, interpreting the heavy metallic clanks outside. "Once that's mounted, they'll shred this door and the wall behind it. We need an exit. Now." "Ceiling?" Davis asked, looking up. "Reinforced concrete slab. We're on the ground floor of a 5-story factory. We aren't blasting through that without C4, and we don't have C4. Silence settled again, heavier than the concrete. They were dead. They all knew it. The logic of war was simple. Trapped, outgunned, no comms, no support. The math equaled 0. Elara's eyes drifted from the map on the wall to the actual structure of the room. The map showed a ventilation exchange behind the rear wall. She scanned the shadows in the corner, behind a towering rack of shelving units that had been bolted to the floor. There, barely visible near the floorboards, was a service hatch. A square metal grate, rusted at the edges, painted the same drab gray as the wall. She stood up and squeezed between the wall and the heavy shelving unit. "Vance, get back in the perimeter," Rogan snapped. "Cover me," she replied, her voice distracted. She reached the grate. It was secured by 4 hex bolts. She pulled her multi-tool from her vest. "What are you doing?" Miller asked, squinting at her. "The map said this backs up to the main HVAC intake," Elara said, working the first bolt loose. The metal screeched in protest. "This system feeds the entire building. If I can get into the main trunk, I can navigate to the roof." "The roof?" Rogan scoffed, walking over. "And do what? Wave a flag?" "The roof has the transmitter array," Elara said, snapping the second bolt. "And it has line of sight to the exfil point. I can signal the helo, or I can flank the command center on the top floor." She pulled the grate free with a metallic clang. A puff of stale, moldy air blew into the room. Rogan shone his light into the hole. It was a square duct, galvanized steel, disappearing into the darkness. He measured it with his eyes. Then he looked at his shoulders. Then he looked at Miller. "It's 12 inches by 14 inches, Rogan said, his voice flat. "My thigh is bigger than that opening." "I know," Elara said. She knelt down and stuck her head inside. It was tight, terrifyingly tight. But she could see a junction box about 10 meters in. She pulled her head back out and looked up at the 3 giant men towering over her. For the first time in her life, their size wasn't an advantage. It was a death sentence. "You can't fit," Elara said. It wasn't a question. "Neither can you with Kit," Miller argued. "And even if you strip down, you'll get stuck at the first turn. It's suicide." "Staying here is suicide," Elara countered. She began unbuckling her plate carrier. "I fit. You don't. End of discussion." Rogan grabbed her shoulder, his grip like a vice. "Vance, look at me. You go in there, you are alone. No backup. If you get jammed, you die of thirst. If they hear you, they pump gas in there or just shoot through the walls. You are a ghost." Elara looked at his hand on her shoulder, then up into his eyes. "I've been invisible my whole life, Chief. Why start seeing me now?" She shrugged off his hand and dropped her heavy vest. She kept her chest rig with the magazines, her radio, useless for now but essential later, and her knife. She grabbed her rifle. It was too long to carry on her back in the tunnel. She would have to push it ahead of her. "Give me the suppressor," she told Miller. "What?" "My suppressor adds 6 inches. Yours is a compact QD. Swap with me." Miller blinked, then wordlessly unscrewed his suppressor and handed it to her. She twisted it onto her barrel. I need 10 minutes to reach the riser, Elara said, lying on her stomach, her body aligned with the dark mouth of the vent. Don't die before I get back. Vance, Rogan said. His voice was different. The mockery was gone. Green light. Go. Elara pushed her rifle into the darkness, then shimmied her shoulders into the cold metal throat of the building. The walls pressed in on her immediately, scraping against her elbows. The darkness swallowed her legs. Cover the grate, she heard Rogan order as her boots disappeared. And pray she's smaller than she looks. She was in. The world narrowed down to a square tunnel of steel and dust. There was no turning back. The world did not exist anymore. There was no sky, no ground, no war. There was only the 12 by 14-inch rectangle of galvanized steel, the smell of ancient dust, and the sound of Elara's own shallow, ragged breathing. Elara Vance was not crawling. She was swimming through a dry, metallic artery. The technique was grueling and repetitive, a torture of inches. Push the rifle, drag the body, freeze, listen, repeat. Her SR-25, even with the shorter barrel and Miller's compact suppressor, was a clumsy companion in the chute. She had to lay it flat on the sheet metal, sliding it forward with her fingertips, then pull herself after it using her elbows and toes. The heavy canvas of her uniform scraped against the steel with a sound that seemed deafening in the enclosed space. Shh, clack, shh, clack. 10 meters in, the darkness became absolute. The ambient light from the supply room grate had faded to nothing. Elara didn't dare use a white light. She flipped her night vision monocular down, but the focal distance was useless at 6 inches. The green phosphor just bloomed into a blurry, nauseating headache against the tunnel walls. She flipped it up and closed her eyes. She would have to move by feel. Clang. The toe of her boot hit a rivet. The sound rang out like a gunshot, vibrating down the length of the shaft. Elara froze, pressing her face into the layer of gray silt coating the bottom of the duct. She held her breath until her lungs burned, waiting for a burst of machine gun fire to tear through the floor of the vent. Silence. Only the distant, dull thumping of heavy artillery outside. She exhaled slowly, the dust coating her tongue with the bitter taste of old insulation and rust. Move, Vance. Move or die. She pulled herself forward again. Something sharp snagged the shoulder of her combat shirt. A sheet metal screw, driven lazily through the exterior during some forgotten maintenance job, was protruding a half-inch into the shaft. It sliced through the fabric and bit into the skin of her deltoid. Elara hissed through gritted teeth, tears pricking her eyes. She couldn't pull back. The barb would just tear deeper. She had to force herself forward, feeling the cold metal rip through her skin before snapping free. Warm blood trickled down her arm, sticky and wet against the dust. Copperhead, this is Pixie, she whispered, her voice barely audible. She keyed the transmit button on her chest rig. Radio check. Over. Static. White washing machine noise. Copperhead, do you copy? Over. Nothing. She stared into the blackness. The galvanized steel walls of the ventilation system were acting as a Faraday cage, blocking the radio waves. She wasn't just physically separated from the seals. She was electronically severed. If she got stuck here, if the tunnel narrowed, if she passed out from the heat rising from the factory floor below, no one would know. She would just be a blockage in the airflow, a skeleton found 20 years later. Panic, cold and primal, clawed at her throat. The walls felt like they were shrinking, pressing in to crush her ribs. This was the one thing the aptitude tests hadn't screened for: the crushing loneliness of the walls. "I've been invisible my whole life," she reminded herself, forcing the panic down into a tight ball in her stomach. "This is just another room where no one sees me." She checked her internal compass. Based on the blueprints, she had crawled maybe 30 meters. The main vertical riser, the artery that would take her to the upper floors, should be coming up on her left. She dragged herself another 10 feet. The air quality changed. It became hotter, carrying the scent of unwashed bodies and tobacco smoke. She stopped. The metal under her stomach was vibrating. At first, she thought it was the factory machinery. Then she realized the vibration had a cadence. It was a voice. Elara pressed her ear against the floor of the duct. The sheet metal was paper thin here, acting as a diaphragm that transmitted sound from the room below. "Check the north corridor. The Americans are cornered." The voice was speaking in a rough dialect of Arabic, distorted but intelligible. It was directly beneath her. She held her breath, her heart hammering against the metal so hard she was terrified they would hear it. She carefully, millimeter by millimeter, tilted her head to look for a gap. A few feet ahead, a sliver of yellow light sliced through the darkness. It was a seam where two sections of ductwork joined, the sealant having cracked with age. Elara inched forward until her eye was pressed to the crack. Through the narrow fissure, she could see the top of a man's head. He was wearing a red and white checkered keffiyeh. He was standing on a table or a crate, which put his head only 2 feet below the ceiling and 2 feet below her. He was shouting instructions to others. She shifted her gaze slightly. There were weapons on the table. Maps. Radios. She wasn't just crawling over a random room. She was crawling over a staging area. The man below looked up. For a terrifying second, his eyes seemed to look straight at the crack in the ceiling. Elara didn't blink. She didn't breathe. "Go," the man barked, turning away. "Bring the RPGs to the hallway. Finish them." Elara's blood ran cold. RPGs. They were bringing heavy ordnance to the supply room. Rogan and the team didn't have 30 minutes. They had maybe 5. She had to get to the roof. She had to find an angle. But to do that, she had to move past this room, and every inch she crawled creaked, the metal above their heads. She gripped her rifle. The mascot was gone. The predator was waking up. Elara held her position above the staging room just long enough to confirm the threat, then forced herself to move. The intelligence was vital, but the immediate danger was the RPG team moving to the hallway. If that rocket struck the supply room door, Rogan and the others would be concussed, breached, and executed within seconds. She slithered past the crack. Her heart rate consciously slowed through breathing exercises despite the stifling heat. Inhale for 4. Hold for 4. Exhale for 4. The tunnel turned sharp right. The metal joint dug into her hip, but her smaller frame allowed her to snake through the 90-degree bend without snagging her rifle, a maneuver that would have trapped Miller or Rogan permanently. 5 meters later, a rectangle of filtered light appeared on the floor of the shaft. Elara crept toward it. It was a return air grill, larger than the previous ones, looking down into the main corridor outside the supply room. She peered through the dusty, diamond-patterned steel mesh. Below her, the scene was chaotic. Dust hung in the air like fog. Debris littered the floor. To her left, she could see the battered steel door of the supply room. It was pockmarked with bullet impacts, the paint stripped away to raw metal. Directly below her vent, 20 feet down, 3 insurgents were setting up a tripod-mounted PKM machine gun. But the real threat was 5 meters further back. A man was kneeling, hefting an RPG-7 onto his shoulder. He was adjusting the optical sight, aiming directly at the supply room door. Another man stood next to him, holding a spare rocket, pointing and shouting corrections. They were preparing to breach. Elara shifted her SR-25. The confines of the duct were brutal. She couldn't deploy the bipod. She couldn't raise her upper body to get a proper cheek weld. She had to lay the rifle flat on the sheet metal, canting her head awkwardly to see through the scope. The shot was a nightmare. First, the mesh. Shooting through a metal screen would deflect the bullet's trajectory. If the round clipped a wire strand, it could tumble, miss the target, or fragment. Second, the angle. She was shooting at a steep 45-degree decline. The bullet would impact high if she didn't compensate. Range, 25 meters. Angle, 45 degrees. Obstruction, steel mesh, approx 2 millimeters thick. She dialed her scope's parallax down to the minimum. Through the glass, the RPG gunner's head filled the reticle. He was sweating, his finger hovering near the trigger mechanism. She couldn't cut the mesh. The sound of wire cutters would be heard instantly in the quiet pause between volleys. She had to shoot through the gaps. She focused on the mesh pattern in front of her muzzle. She needed to thread a 7.62 millimeter needle through a hole barely half an inch wide. Wait for it. Outside the factory, the rhythm of the battle shifted. The distant thump, thump, thump of a mortar barrage began walking closer to the building. The insurgent with the RPG yelled something, bracing his legs. He was about to fire. Thump! A mortar round hit the factory roof somewhere far above. Dust shook loose from the ceiling. Thump! Closer. Elara placed the crosshair on the base of the gunner's skull. She exhaled, emptying her lungs until she was a statue. Thump. As the third, loudest explosion rocked the building, Elara squeezed the trigger. Pfft. The sound of the suppressed shot inside the metal tunnel was a sharp, overpressured sneeze, swallowed instantly by the reverberation of the mortar strike outside. The bullet threaded the steel mesh perfectly. It struck the RPG gunner just below the ear. There was no drama, no scream. The man simply ceased to function. He crumpled straight down, the loaded RPG launcher clattering uselessly to the concrete floor. The rocket did not detonate. The loader standing next to him flinched, looking around wildly. He saw his comrade drop. He looked at the supply room door, assuming the SEALs had fired through it. He raised his rifle and sprayed a desperate burst at the steel door. "Sniper!" someone shouted in Arabic. "From the door!" The insurgents focused all their attention on the SEALs' position, firing blindly at the thick walls. They had no idea the death had come from the ceiling. Elara didn't celebrate. She didn't even blink. She cycled the bolt of her rifle, catching the ejected brass casing with her left hand so it wouldn't rattle against the metal floor. The brass burned her palm, but she held it tight. One down. But the loader was reaching for the fallen RPG. She reacquired the target. The angle was harder now. He was moving. No, don't get greedy. If she fired again from the same spot, someone might look up and see the muzzle flash or the spark on the grate. The element of surprise was a resource she couldn't squander. She had bought Rogan time. Now she had to buy herself position. Elara crab-walked backward, away from the grate, fading back into the darkness of the shaft just as the loader looked up, his eyes scanning the ceiling in confusion. He saw nothing but dust motes dancing in the light. She turned and began the agonizing climb toward the vertical riser. The hunt had begun. The horizontal duct ended abruptly at a T-junction. To the left, a dead end blocked by a collapsed fire damper. To the right, the main vertical riser, a dark, square throat stretching upward through the skeleton of the factory. Elara stared up. It was a straight climb, perhaps 15 feet to the next lateral access point. In a gym, 15 feet was a warm-up. Inside a greasy, dust-slicked, galvanized steel chute, wearing 20 pounds of kit and carrying a long rifle, it was a mountain. She adjusted her sling, tightening the SR-25 against her back until it dug into her spine. If the rifle banged against the walls, she was dead. If she slipped, she was dead. She stepped into the riser. The shaft was roughly 2 feet wide here, too wide to brace easily, too narrow to move freely. She adopted a chimney technique, pressing her back against the rear wall and planting her boots against the front face. Push, slide, lock, breathe. She moved inches at a time. The rubber soles of her boots squeaked faintly against the metal, a sound that made her cringe every time. Gravity pulled at her utility belt, dragging her down. Her quadriceps, already burning from the 3-kilometer sprint to the target, began to tremble uncontrollably. 5 feet up, the air grew hotter. The heat from the machinery below and the desert sun beating on the roof above turned the shaft into a convection oven. Sweat soaked through her base layer, stinging the fresh cuts on her arms. 10 feet up. Her vision blurred with exertion. Scritch. A sharp, metallic tearing sound stopped her cold. Elara tried to push upward, but she was anchored. Something on her chest rig had snagged a jagged, rusted bracket protruding from the corner of the shaft. She pushed harder, but the resistance was absolute. She looked down, straining her neck. The nylon webbing of her hydration pouch, her only source of water, was impaled on a metal spur. She tried to reach down to unhook it, but the geometry of the shaft made it impossible. If she took her hands off the wall to fiddle with the snag, she would lose her friction lock and plummet. She was stuck, suspended 10 feet above the junction, legs burning, arms shaking, trapped by a piece of cheap nylon. "Come on," she hissed through gritted teeth. She tried to jerk free. The metal bracket groaned ominously. The noise echoed down the shaft like a gong. Freeze, she couldn't force it. The noise would betray her. She had 2 choices. Climb down and start over, impossible with her failing muscles, or cut the weight. Elara reached for the knife on her shoulder strap. Her hand shook. She unfolded the blade, the steel gleaming dully in the pitch black. She had to cut the hydration carrier loose. In the desert heat, abandoning her water was a tactical disaster. Dehydration would set in within hours, degrading her cognitive function and aim. But staying here meant capture. Mission first. She slashed the strap. The nylon parted with a snap. The heavy water bladder swung free. Before it could fall and crash into the metal floor 10 feet below, a sound that would alert every guard on the ground floor. Elara lunged with her free hand. She caught the strap just as gravity took hold. The sudden shift in weight nearly pulled her off the wall. She gasped, her boots slipping an inch before finding traction again. She was holding the water bladder, dangling it over the abyss. She couldn't carry it in her hand and climb. She couldn't reattach it. She looked at the rusted bracket that had trapped her. Carefully, agonizingly, she wedged the hydration pouch into the gap between the bracket and the wall, jamming it tight so it wouldn't fall. She looked at it one last time, her lifeline in the heat, and left it behind. Lighter now, but thirstier. Elara resumed the climb. Her muscles screamed. Her fingers felt like they were bleeding under her gloves. 12 feet. 14 feet. Her hand found the lip of the second-floor lateral duct. She hooked her elbow over the edge, gasping for air, and hauled her body up and over. She rolled into the horizontal shaft of the second level, collapsing onto the cool metal. Her chest heaved against the floor. She licked her cracked lips. No water, just dust. She checked her rifle. The optic was covered in grime, but the glass was intact. She was on the second floor, the mezzanine, the domain of the enemy snipers who had pinned down her team. Elara forced herself to her knees. She wasn't safe yet. She was just higher up the food chain. The second floor was known as the ballroom on the tactical maps, not because of any grandeur, but because of its vast, open floor plan that overlooked the factory floor below like a theater balcony. Once, it had been the administrative heart of the facility. Now, it was a sniper's paradise. Elara pushed herself along the ductwork, her movements slower now. The thirst was beginning to manifest as a dull headache behind her eyes, but the adrenaline kept the edges of her vision sharp. The sound of gunfire here was deafeningly loud. She reached a ventilation register set high in the wall, near the ceiling. Unlike the floor vents, this one gave her a panoramic view of the mezzanine. Through the slats, she saw them. 3 insurgents. They were spaced out with professional discipline, roughly 10 meters apart, forming a lethal interlocking field of fire. They were armed with Dragunov SVDs, the long barrels resting on the railing, pointed down at the supply room door where Rogan and the others were trapped. Boom! The center sniper fired. Boom! The left sniper fired. They were taking turns, keeping a rhythmic, suppressing beat that prevented the SEALs from even cracking the door. They were relaxed, almost bored. To them, the Americans were rats in a trap, and they were the cats waiting for the inevitable hunger to drive them out. Elara adjusted her position. The SR-25 felt heavy in her trembling hands. She pressed the stock into her shoulder, forcing her breathing to steady. Target identification, Target 1, left. Prone, focused entirely on his scope. Target 2, right. Sitting, smoking a cigarette while watching the rear stairwell. Target 3, center. The leader, standing, spotting with binoculars. He was the dangerous one. If she shot one, the other 2 would react instantly. The acoustics of the factory were cavernous. The echo would mask the direction of her suppressed shot for maybe half a second. That was her window. She did the math. The distance was short, less than 40 meters, but the factory was drafty. Wind gusted through shattered windows, creating unpredictable cross-currents even indoors. Windage, negligible. Elevation, -2 MOA for angle. She needed to take the leader first. If the brain is gone, the body flails. But the leader was moving, pacing back and forth. The prone sniper on the left was the easiest shot, but killing him would alert the leader. She shifted her aim to the right, the smoker, then back to the left. No, the geometry is wrong. If she fired from this vent, her field of view was limited by the slats. She could only engage 2 of them without shifting her entire body and revealing her position. She had to make a choice. Save the team from the suppression, or save herself from discovery. "Sorry, Chief," she whispered. She centered the crosshair on the back of the prone sniper's head. Target 1. Squeeze. The rifle bucked gently. The subsonic round hissed through the air. Target 1 slumped forward over his rifle, silent and limp. Elara immediately racked the bolt, semi-automatic speed. She swung the barrel toward the leader. Target 3. He had seen his man drop. He was already spinning around, shouting a warning, raising his binoculars to scan the upper levels. Too fast. He wasn't looking at the other windows. He was looking at the walls. He knew. Elara fired. The shot went wide, striking the metal railing inches from his hip. Sparks showered down. The leader dove for cover behind a concrete pillar. "Sniper! In the vents! North wall!" he screamed in Arabic, his voice echoing through the ballroom. Target 2, the smoker, scrambled to his feet, raising his rifle toward Elara's position. Elara cursed. She had lost the initiative. She swung the rifle toward Target 2. He was exposed, but he was bringing his weapon to bear. She fired a double tap. Pop, pop. One round caught him in the chest plate. No penetration, but enough force to knock the wind out of him. The second round went high, striking his throat. He dropped, clutching his neck, gargling blood. 2 down. But the leader, Target 3, was safe behind the pillar, and now he knew exactly where she was. Elara watched the pillar through her scope. She saw the barrel of his SVD poke out, not aiming at the supply room anymore, but aiming high. Aiming at the registers. He began to fire. Crack. A bullet tore through the sheet metal 6 inches to the left of Elara's face. The sound inside the duct was amplified 10 times, a ringing slap that left her ears buzzing. Crack. Another round, closer. He was walking his fire across the ventilation line. He was hunting the hunter. Elara scrambled backward, crab-walking deeper into the shadows of the shaft. Dust exploded around her as bullets punched through the thin metal skin of the ductwork like it was paper. Beams of light shot through the new holes, illuminating the swirling dust. She couldn't stay here. She had cleared the suppression on the seals, but she had just painted a target on her own back. "Rogan, snipers are neutralized," she gasped into the radio, praying the signal would bounce through the holes the bullets had just made. "But I'm compromised. Moving to level 3. There was no reply. Just the terrifying sound of the enemy leader reloading his magazine below, preparing to turn the ventilation shaft into a sieve. The ventilation shaft, once her sanctuary, had become a death trap. The enemy leader wasn't aiming anymore. He was suppressing. The heavy crack thud of 7.62 conformal. The rounds, impacting the ceiling below her, reverberated through the steel skeleton of the building like a hammer striking a bell. Elara didn't just hear the shots. She felt them. Each impact sent a shockwave through the sheet metal floor against her chest, rattling her teeth. Move. Just move. She abandoned stealth. The slow, methodical crawl of a sniper was replaced by a desperate, scrambling lizard crawl. She dragged her SR-25 by the sling, elbows digging furiously into the dust-slicked metal, knees bruising against the rivets. Ping! A bullet punched through the bottom of the duct, 6 inches behind her right boot. A jagged exit hole erupted in the metal, the steel curling upward like a deadly flower. A second round tore through moments later, passing so close to her helmet that the supersonic snap made her ears ring despite the electronic noise cancellation. He was tracking her, or guessing. It didn't matter. He was walking his fire down the line of the ductwork, tracing the path of the airflow. Elara scrambled around a corner, gasping for air that was now thick with pulverized drywall and lead dust. The turn bought her a few seconds of respite from the direct line of fire, but she could hear shouting below. They weren't just shooting, they were moving. They were sending men up the stairwells to cut off the vents. She needed to get vertical again. She needed to reach the roof. She pushed forward, her headlamp switched off, relying on the faint, ambient light filtering through the seams. 10 meters ahead, the tunnel narrowed into a junction box. She reached it and froze. Blocked. The junction, which should have led to the third-floor riser, was choked with decades of debris. Old insulation, a collapsed bird's nest, and a massive, rusted industrial fan blade that had sheared off and wedged itself diagonally across the passage. Elara shoved against the fan blade. It didn't budge. It was solid iron, cemented in place by rust and time. Behind her, the gunfire was getting closer. Crack, crack, crack. The rounds were chewing up the straightaway she had just navigated. "Damn it!" she hissed, panic fluttering in her throat like a trapped moth. She couldn't go back. She couldn't go forward. Staying here meant waiting for a bullet to find her legs. She looked down. Directly beneath her, in the floor of the junction box, was a service grate. It was smaller than the others, maybe 12 by 12 inches, crusted with paint. She didn't know what room was below. It could be an empty closet. It could be a hallway filled with fighters. But the alternative was being turned into Swiss cheese inside a tin can. Elara rolled onto her back, bringing her knees up to her chest in the cramped space. She braced her boots against the grate. 1, 2, she kicked out with everything she had. The rusted screws groaned but held. A bullet struck the fan blade, blocking her path, sending a shower of sparks raining down onto her face. The ricochet whined past her ear, slicing a chaotic line through the metal wall. "Now!" Elara screamed a silent cry of exertion and drove her heels into the grate again. Crunch. The metal gave way. The grate, along with a chunk of the drywall ceiling it was attached to, fell away into the room below. Elara didn't hesitate. She rolled over and dropped through the hole, rifle clutched tight to her chest. She fell 8 feet. She landed in a crouch, her boots skidding on a tiled floor. The impact jarred her spine, but her adrenaline absorbed the pain. She instantly brought her weapon up, scanning the room. It was a bathroom. Cracked mirrors, filthy sinks, and stalls with missing doors. The air smelled of sewage and stale water, and she wasn't alone. Standing at the urinal, frozen mid-zip, was a man. He was large, wearing dirty fatigues and a black vest. His AK-47 was leaning against the wall, just out of arm's reach. He stared at her, eyes wide with shock. He looked at the hole in the ceiling, then down at the small, dust-covered figure that had just fallen out of the sky. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. The absurdity of the moment hung suspended in the air. A 4'11" American girl, covered in gray soot, pointing a suppressed sniper rifle at a terrorist in a bathroom. The man's eyes shifted to his AK-47. Elara saw the muscle twitch in his shoulder. The decision was made. He lunged for the weapon. Elara pulled the trigger. Click. A misfire. The dust from the vent had fouled the action, or the magazine wasn't seated right from the fall. The man's hand closed around the pistol grip of his AK-47. He swung it around, a roar building in his throat. Elara didn't have time to clear the jam. She dropped the rifle, letting it hang by its sling, and drew the combat knife from her shoulder rig. The blade was 6 inches of serrated steel, tiny compared to the assault rifle swinging toward her head. "Die!" he screamed in Arabic. Elara ducked under the barrel of the AK-47 as it smashed into the tiled wall where her head had been a fraction of a second ago. Porcelain shattered, spraying the room with razor-sharp shards. She was inside his guard now, too close for him to shoot, but close enough for him to crush her. The hunt in the walls was over. The brawl on the tiles had begun. The tiled bathroom was no longer a room. It was a cage, and Elara was trapped inside with a beast. The insurgent swung the AK-47 like a baseball bat. Elara dropped her center of gravity, collapsing her knees just as the wooden stock of the rifle smashed into the wall where her head had been a microsecond before. The impact pulverized the ceramic tiles, sending razor-sharp shrapnel raining down on her helmet. She lunged forward, staying low. In a stand-up fight, his reach would kill her. She had to get inside his guard, into the space where his long arms and the rifle were useless. She drove her shoulder into his midsection. It was like hitting a brick wall. He barely stumbled. He roared, dropping the rifle and grabbing her by the straps of her plate carrier. With a terrifying display of brute strength, he lifted her 95-pound frame off the ground and slammed her backward into the row of sinks. Crack. Her lower back collided with the porcelain basin. The pain was blinding, a white-hot spike that shot up her spine. Her vision swam. For a second, she couldn't breathe. He didn't let go. He pinned her against the broken sink with one massive hand on her chest, his fingers scrabbling for her throat above the ceramic plate. His other hand reached for a jagged shard of the broken mirror on the wall. Elara stared up at him. She could smell the sour stench of tobacco and fear on his breath. She saw the dilated pupils of a man running on pure adrenaline. He wasn't a soldier. He was a brawler, and he was going to butcher her. She had one advantage. He was looking at her face. He wasn't looking at her hands. Her right hand was still gripping her combat knife, the 6-inch blade she had drawn before the fall. Her arm was pinned between their bodies, compressed against her ribs. She couldn't stab him in the chest. His tactical vest was thick, probably carrying hard plates. She couldn't reach his neck. His reach kept his head too far back. Anatomy solved the equation. She looked down. His legs were splayed wide to brace himself as he leaned in to crush her windpipe. His inner thigh was exposed. Elara gritted her teeth, blinking away the black spots in her vision. She rotated her wrist, reversing the grip on the knife so the blade pointed downward. She screamed, a primal, guttural sound of exertion, and drove the knife down with every ounce of strength she possessed. The blade sank deep into his upper thigh, severing the heavy fabric of his fatigues and plunging into the soft flesh of the groin. She felt the sickening resistance of muscle, then the sudden release as the tip found the femoral artery. She twisted the blade and ripped it free. The effect was instantaneous. A jet of bright arterial blood sprayed across the white tiles, soaking Elara's legs. The man's eyes went wide. The grip on her throat loosened. He staggered back, clutching his leg, a look of profound confusion replacing the rage on his face. The human body contains roughly 5 liters of blood. With a severed femoral artery, unconsciousness occurs in under a minute. Death follows shortly after. He tried to step toward her, to finish it, but his leg buckled. He collapsed heavily onto the wet floor, his hand slipping on his own blood. Elara slid down the wall, gasping for air, her hand clutching her bruised ribs. She watched him. This wasn't like the clean, distant pink mist of a sniper kill. This was intimate. It was messy. It was wet. He looked at her one last time, his lips moving silently, before his eyes rolled back and his head cracked against the tile. The room was silent save for the dripping of water from a broken pipe and the ragged sound of her own breathing. Elara looked at her hands. They were coated in red. She felt a wave of nausea roll over her, violent and sudden. She wanted to vomit. She wanted to scrub her skin off. No time. Focus. Voices. Loud, angry voices were shouting in the corridor just outside the bathroom door. They had heard the crash. "Ahmed! Ahmed!" The doorknob rattled. It was locked from the inside, likely by the man she had just killed for privacy. Thud. Someone threw their shoulder against the door. Elara scrambled to her feet, slipping in the blood. She looked up at the hole in the ceiling she had fallen from. 8 feet high, impossible to reach without a boost, and she didn't have the strength to pull herself up. She scanned the room frantically. The door shuddered under another blow. The wood frame cracked. Think. Think. Behind the row of toilets near the floor was a maintenance access panel, a small, louvered metal door used for plumbing repairs. It was tiny, maybe 14 inches square. Elara grabbed her rifle from where it had fallen. She didn't bother wiping the blood off it. She dove into the last stall and kicked the panel. It was rusted shut. Crash. The bathroom door splintered open. Elara jammed the tip of her knife into the seam of the panel and pried. The metal groaned and popped open. A dark, narrow pipe chase lay beyond. "He is dead! They are here!" A voice screamed from the bathroom entrance. Boots crunched on the broken glass. They were sweeping the room. Elara shoved her rifle into the hole and squeezed her body in after it. Her hips scraped the sides. Her vest caught on a pipe. She exhaled fully, collapsing her ribcage, and forced herself through the gap just as a burst of gunfire shredded the stall door behind her. She pulled her legs in and rolled into the darkness of the plumbing chase, the wooden splinters from the door showering the space where her feet had been seconds ago. She was alive, but she was deeper in the maze, bleeding, battered, and covered in the blood of a man whose face she would never forget. The pipe chase was a vertical coffin of cast iron and cobwebs. Elara climbed using the plumbing brackets as a ladder, her boots slipping on the condensation that coated the cold metal pipes. The space was barely 18 inches wide, forcing her to climb sideways, her back scraping against the rough concrete of the shaft wall. Every movement was agony. The bruise on her lower back from the bathroom sink throbbed with a sickening, deep heat, and the cut on her arm had reopened, gluing her sleeve to her skin with drying blood. But she kept moving. She had to. Below her, the sounds of the search party tearing apart the bathroom faded, replaced by the mechanical hum of the rooftop ventilation units. She reached the termination of the chase, a service access panel leading to the interstitial space above the 5th floor. This was the executive level, the penthouse. Elara pushed the panel open and slithered out onto a suspended ceiling grid. Below her, through the acoustic tiles, she could hear the distinct, rhythmic hum of activity. Not the chaotic shouting of the foot soldiers downstairs, but the controlled, urgent murmur of a command post. She crawled across the steel beams supporting the ceiling, careful not to put her weight on the fragile tiles. If she slipped here, she would fall right into the center of the enemy's brain. She found a gap in the tiles where a bundle of Ethernet cables ran down into the room below. Lying flat on her stomach, she pressed her eye to the opening. The room was vast, formerly a conference hall, now converted into a tactical operations center. Heavy black curtains covered the windows. In the center, a cluster of tables was covered in maps, laptops, and radios. And there they were. The room was guarded by 6 men. They weren't wearing the ragtag fatigues of the fighters downstairs. These men wore matching black tactical gear, body armor, and carried suppressed carbines. Elites, the Praetorian Guard. In the middle of the room stood 2 men. One was the sniper leader she had missed in the ballroom. She recognized the bandage on his hand where the railing shrapnel had likely cut him. The other was an older man, heavy-set, wearing a pristine white thobe and smoking a thick cigar. The high-value target, the architect. He was leaning over a laptop watching a grainy live feed. Elara squinted. It was a security camera feed of the supply room door on the 1st floor. They had eyes on Rogan. The DSHK is in position, the sniper leader said in Arabic, pointing at the map. We breach in 2 minutes. No prisoners. The HVT nodded, puffing on his cigar. Burn them out, then hang their bodies from the factory sign. Elara pulled back slightly. She had positive identification, PID. She had the location, but she had a problem. She reached for her chest rig to grab a fresh magazine. Her hand grasped empty air. She froze. She patted the pouches. Empty. Empty. During the struggle in the bathroom, or perhaps during the climb in the shaft, the retention bungee on her secondary mag pouch had snapped. The magazine was gone. She ejected the magazine currently in her rifle and checked the witness holes. 5 rounds. She had 5 rounds of .308 match remaining. She looked back down through the hole. 6 elite guards, 2 commanders, 8 targets, 5 bullets. The math was impossible. A wave of despair washed over her, heavier than the fatigue. She had come all this way, survived the vents, the sniper duel, the bathroom brawl, only to fail because of simple arithmetic. She couldn't kill them all. If she took the shot at the HVT, the 6 guards would spray the ceiling with enough lead to turn her into confetti before she could cycle the bolt. Think, Vance. You don't fight with force. You fight with geometry. She scanned the room again. She didn't look at the men. She looked at the structure. The HVT and the sniper leader were standing behind a long, heavy oak table. Behind them was a wall of reinforced glass that separated the conference room from an observation deck. They were moving. The HVT paced nervously, smoke trailing from his cigar. The sniper leader followed him, gesturing. Elara watched their pattern. They were arguing about the final assault. Cross, stop, turn, cross. Every time they turned at the end of the table, for a fraction of a second, their silhouettes overlapped. 2 heads, 1 line. If she could put a single round through both of them, she would decapitate the enemy command structure instantly. The guards would panic. Chaos would filter down the chain of command. But the shot had to be perfect. And it had to be now. Elara adjusted her position on the steel beam. She couldn't shoot through the acoustic tile. It would deflect the bullet. She quietly pulled her combat knife, and with infinite care, sliced a 2-inch hole in the tile. Dust drifted down, invisible in the cigar smoke haze. She lowered the muzzle of the SR-25 into the hole. She settled behind the scope. The magnification was too high for this range. All she saw was a blur of white fabric and black gear. She dialed it back. The HVT walked to the left. The sniper leader followed. Tell them to fire, the HVT ordered. Wait, the sniper leader said, stepping in front of him. The Americans are crafty. Let me check the flank. Align. The sniper leader's head moved into the crosshairs. Behind him, slightly out of focus, was the HVT's head. They were not perfectly aligned yet. An inch off. If she fired now, she would kill the lieutenant, but the HVT would survive to duck and order the execution of her team. She needed them to freeze. She needed a distraction, but she couldn't make a sound. Suddenly, the radio on the table crackled. Breach team ready. Awaiting order. Both men stopped. The sniper leader turned his head slightly to look at the HVT. The HVT leaned in to listen. The gap closed. The 2 heads became one shape in her scope. Elara's finger tightened on the trigger. She had 4 bullets for the 6 guards. But this first bullet, this one had to do the work of 2. She exhaled, her heart rate slowing to a rhythmic thud in her ears that matched the ticking of the clock on the wall below. Elara's finger rested on the trigger curve, the metal warm against her skin. Through the scope, the 2 heads, one wrapped in a keffiyeh, the other in a white gutra, were merging into a single, chaotic silhouette. But as she focused, a glint of light shifted across the image, a reflection. Her breath hitched. She wasn't looking at them through open air. The gap in the ceiling she had found was actually looking down through a skylight panel of the internal security booth, a soundproof, bullet-resistant glass enclosure within the command center, designed to protect VIPs from assassination. She was about to fire a 168-grain projectile through multi-laminated polycarbonate glass at a 40-degree angle. Panic flared hot and bright. Abort. Physics dictated that when a bullet strikes glass at an angle, two things happen. First, refraction. The light bending through the thick glass meant the targets were not physically where her eyes told her they were. Second, deflection. The glass would strip the copper jacket from the lead core and shove the bullet's trajectory upward upon exit. If she aimed at the image, she would miss high and right. The bullet would shatter the glass, alert the room, and she would be dead in 3 seconds. The HVT turned. The alignment was breaking. She had less than a second. Elara didn't panic. She didn't pray. She retreated into the one place where she was bigger than anyone else. Her mind. The world slowed down. The shouting men, the hum of the servers, the throbbing pain in her back. It all faded into white noise. Equations cascaded behind her eyes, replacing the fear. Distance, 18 meters. Angle of incidence, 40 degrees. Glass thickness, estimated 1.5 inches. Refractive index of polycarbonate, 1.585. Vertical deflection. Variable +2 inches. She didn't need a computer. She was the computer. If the image is here, the reality is lower, and the bullet will kick up. So aim lower still. She shifted the crosshairs. She moved the aim point off the HVT's head, dragging it down to the sniper leader's neck, a spot that looked like a miss. To any other sniper, it would look like suicide. To Elara, it was the only solution. Target, the emptiness between the collar and the jaw. Fire! The HVT shouted below, his voice muffled by the glass. Elara squeezed. Crack. The sound of the SR-25 firing inside the ceiling plenum was apocalyptic, a thunderclap in a shoebox. The bullet left the muzzle at 2,600 feet per second. It struck the glass skylight. The reinforced pane didn't just break, it atomized at the impact point. The bullet shed its copper jacket in a spray of molten metal, the lead core deforming but retaining its mass. As predicted, the glass bit into the projectile, throwing it upward, but Elara had aimed low. The lead core exited the glass and corrected its path, screaming downward into the skull of the sniper leader. It entered behind his right ear, mushrooming instantly. It didn't stop. It tore through his cranial vault, exiting the left temple with catastrophic force. The HVT was standing directly behind him, leaning in to hear a whisper that would never come. The bullet, slowed, but still traveling at lethal velocity, struck the HVT in the bridge of the nose. It was a gory, kinetic miracle. In the span of a single heartbeat, the two men commanding the siege ceased to exist. Their bodies collapsed backward as if their strings had been cut, spraying blood across the pristine maps on the table. The sound of the shattering skylight rained down on the room like diamonds. For 1 second, there was absolute silence in the command center. The 6 elite guards froze, staring at the ruin of their leaders. Their brains couldn't process the geometry of the death. The angle was impossible. The glass was bulletproof. Then, chaos. "Contact high! Ceiling!" one guard screamed, raising his carbine. Elara racked the bolt. 4 rounds left. The impossible was done. Now she had to survive the consequences. She shifted her aim instantly, not to the guards, there were too many, but to the main breaker panel on the far wall, glowing with green LEDs. Kill the lights, own the dark. She fired again. The second round from Elara's rifle slammed into the main breaker panel. A shower of blue-white sparks erupted, and then the command center plunged into absolute, suffocating darkness. For the 6 elite guards, the world effectively ended. Their eyes, dilated for the bright fluorescent lights of the tactical map, were instantly useless. For Elara, the world turned green. She flipped her PVS-31 night vision goggles down with a snap of her wrist. The room was washed in the grainy, monochromatic phosphor glow. The guards were flailing silhouettes, shouting in panic, their weapon lights cutting chaotic beams through the lingering cigar smoke. 3 rounds left. Elara didn't stay in the ceiling. She couldn't control the room from a peephole. She swung her legs through the shattered skylight frame and dropped onto the heavy oak table, landing amidst the glass shards and the warm blood of the dead commanders. The sound of her boots on the wood drew the beams of 6 flashlights. She was already moving. She fired her SR-25 from the hip, point-blank range. Bang, bang, bang. 3 shots. 3 guards closest to the table crumpled, their armor useless at this distance. Click. Empty. The SR-25 was a club now. Elara dropped it. A guard to her left roared, swinging his carbine toward the sound of the bolt locking back. Elara dove off the table, rolling under his spray of bullets. She drew her Sig Sauer P320 sidearm mid-roll. Pop, pop. 2 rounds to the pelvic girdle. He dropped to his knees. Pop. 1 to the head. 2 guards left. They were firing wildly, shredding the maps, the laptops, the walls. Elara scrambled toward the dead guard she had just dropped. She holstered her pistol and ripped the carbine, a suppressed HK-416, from his dying hands. She rolled onto her back, bringing the stolen weapon up. The laser designator danced across the smoke. She found the last 2 heat signatures. Thud, 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 thud. Controlled pairs. The remaining guards dropped into the silence. Elara stood up in the center of the carnage. The room was secured, but the mission wasn't over. She grabbed the radio from the belt of the dead sniper leader. She keyed the mic, praying the frequency was still open to the units below. "Start your run," she whispered in Arabic, mimicking the dead commander's voice as best she could. "Cease fire on the supply room. Advance to the courtyard." It was a bluff. She needed the enemy forces downstairs to lift their suppression on Rogan's team for just a few seconds, thinking they were moving in for the kill. She sprinted to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the factory floor. She smashed the glass with the butt of the stolen carbine. Below, the scene was a nightmare. Hundreds of insurgents were swarming toward the supply room. Then, the door of the supply room kicked open. "Moving!" Rogan's voice roared, faint but distinct even from 5 stories up. Rogan, Miller, and Davis burst out of the room, weapons blazing, but they were running into a wall of meat. The insurgents, realizing the order to cease fire was fake, began to turn their weapons back on the SEALs. "Not today," Elara growled. She mounted the HK-416 on the window ledge. She flicked the selector switch past semi, past burst, all the way to auto. She wasn't a sniper anymore. She was a machine gunner. Elara unleashed hell. She swept the factory floor from left to right, walking the rounds into the clusters of enemy fighters flanking the SEALs. The high ground advantage was devastating. The insurgents had no cover from above. Rat-tat-tat-tat-tat-tat-tat. She burned through the first magazine in 3 seconds. She grabbed another from the dead guard's vest. Reload. Rack. Fire. She prioritized the RPG teams, the machine gun nests, anyone trying to flank Rogan. The stolen rifle began to smoke. The suppressor, designed for short engagements, was glowing a dull, angry cherry red under her NVGs. The heat mirage distorted her sight picture, but she didn't stop. The SEALs were moving fast, cutting a swath through the confused enemy ranks, using the chaos she was creating as a shield. Click. Empty. Reload. Covering! Moving! Elara fired another burst. The suppressor turned white-hot. The baffles inside began to melt and disintegrate. K-pow. The suppressor failed catastrophically, blowing off the end of the barrel in a shower of sparks and metal fragments. The sound of the rifle changed from a polite thud to a deafening, raw crack that echoed like thunder in the enclosed space. She was loud now. Every fighter in the building knew exactly where the death was coming from. Bullets began to impact the wall around her window. Concrete exploded into dust. A round grazed her helmet, snapping her head back. She didn't flinch. She kept firing the unsuppressed, short-barreled rifle, the muzzle flash blinding in the darkness, a beacon of defiance. Rogan and the team reached the main exit gates. They breached the sunlight. The radio on the dead commander's desk squawked. But this time, it wasn't Arabic. It was a voice she knew. Copperhead, this is Bulldog. We are clear. I repeat, we are clear. Elara stopped firing. Her hands were numb. The rifle barrel was smoking so badly it obscured the window. Pixie. Rogan's voice crackled, breathless and urgent. Pixie, sound off. Where the hell are you? Elara slumped against the wall, sliding down to the floor amidst the bodies of the elite guard. She keyed her own radio, hoping the Faraday cage effect was weaker near the window. Penthouse, she rasped, her throat raw from the smoke. I'm in the penthouse. The roof, Rogan commanded immediately. Get to the roof. We're coming around for extraction. Do not die on me now, Vance. That is a direct order. Elara looked at the door of the command center. She could hear boots thundering up the stairwell. The entire building was coming for her. Copy, she whispered. Moving. The door to the command center splintered inward, buckling under the combined force of a dozen boots and rifle butts. Elara didn't wait to see the faces of the men storming the room. She was already over the windowsill. She swung out into the void, her fingers scrabbling for purchase on a rusted drainage pipe running down the exterior wall. The factory air was cooler here, but it smelled of burning rubber and cordite. 5 stories down, the courtyard was a kaleidoscope of violence. The SEALs had established a tenuous perimeter near the main gate, their strobe lights flashing rhythmically to mark the landing zone, LZ, for the inbound extract. But between Elara and the ground lay 50 feet of vertical concrete and a hornet's nest of enemy fighters pouring out of the lower exits. Crack, crack, crack. Bullets chipped the masonry around her hands. The insurgents in the command center were crowding the window, firing down at her. Elara slid. She didn't climb down. She wrapped her boots around the pipe and let gravity take her. The friction burned through her trousers, searing her inner thighs. At the 3rd floor, the pipe groaned, rusted brackets snapping like pistol shots. The metal pulled away from the wall. Elara gasped as she swung wildly out into open air, the pipe bending under her weight. She looked down. Directly below her, about 20 feet down, was the flat, corrugated metal roof of a loading dock extension. From there, it was another 15 feet to a massive industrial dumpster in the alleyway. Vance! Jump! Rogan's voice tore through the static in her earpiece. He was watching her from the ground, his weapon raised, firing single shots at the window she had just vacated. The pipe sheared off completely at the top. Elara fell. She dropped 10 feet, hitting the corrugated roof of the loading dock with a bone-jarring slam. She rolled instinctively, dispersing the impact, but the air left her lungs in a painful whoosh. She lay there for a second, stunned, staring at the night sky. "Move! Get up!" Bullets began to stitch a line across the metal roof. The fighters above had the angle. Elara scrambled to her feet, stumbling. Her right ankle flared with hot pain, sprained, maybe hairline fracture. She limped toward the edge of the loading dock. Below her, the dumpster was filled with refuse. Cardboard, drywall, trash. It was a soft landing, relatively speaking, but the alleyway around it was a kill zone. She hesitated. The jump was high enough to break a leg if she landed wrong. If she broke a leg here, she was dead weight. "Jump, Pixie! I've got you!" She looked down. Master Chief Rogan wasn't behind the concrete barriers with the rest of the team. He had broken cover. He was sprinting across the open courtyard, firing his MK-48 from the hip, suppressing the ground floor exits to clear her path. He was exposing himself to hundreds of guns. For her. Elara didn't think about the height anymore. She stepped back, took a breath, and launched herself off the edge. For a second, she was weightless. The wind rushed past her ears, carrying the sounds of the battle, the shouting, the explosions, the rotor wash of the approaching Black Hawk. She hit the dumpster. She crashed through layers of soggy cardboard and debris. The impact was violent, throwing her jaw shut with a clack that chipped a tooth. The smell of rotting garbage filled her nose. She tried to stand, but her legs were tangled in trash. Her head swam. A shadow blocked the light. Rogan vaulted over the side of the dumpster. He didn't ask if she was okay. He reached down, grabbed the drag handle on the back of her plate carrier with one hand, and hauled her out of the trash like she was a rag doll. "On your feet!" he roared, pulling her over the rim of the dumpster. Elara's boots hit the pavement. Her bad ankle buckled, but Rogan didn't let her fall. He shoved his shoulder under her arm, effectively carrying half her weight, while keeping his machine gun raised with his free arm. "Moving! Covering!" Miller shouted from the gate, unleashing a wall of lead to cover their retreat. They ran. It was an ugly three-legged hobble, but they moved fast. Bullets kicked up sparks around their feet. An RPG whooshed overhead, detonating harmlessly against the factory wall. The sound of the helicopter drowned out everything else. The MH-60 flared hard over the courtyard, the door gunner's minigun spinning up with a sound like tearing canvas. Brrrt. The minigun swept the factory facade, turning the windows and walls into dust. The enemy fire ceased instantly, suppressed by the overwhelming firepower of the bird. Rogan practically threw Elara onto the ramp of the helicopter. She slid across the metal floor, slick with hydraulic fluid. He dove in after her. "Go! Go! Go!" The bird lifted immediately, banking hard to the right. Elara rolled onto her back, gasping, her chest heaving. She looked out the open door as the factory, her prison, her hunting ground, shrank into the distance, burning in the night. She looked at Rogan. He was sitting opposite her, wiping sweat and grime from his face. His eyes were locked on hers. He reached out a gloved hand and grabbed her vest, pulling her slightly closer to check her pupils. "You good?" he shouted over the rotor noise. Elara nodded, too exhausted to speak. "You're crazy," Rogan said. He didn't smile, but he slapped her shoulder, a firm, solid impact of camaraderie. "You fit right in." Elara closed her eyes. The pain in her body was screaming, but for the first time in her career, The silence of being an outsider was gone. The interior of the MH-60 Black Hawk was a vibrating womb of noise and red light. The tactical flight over the desert floor was low and fast, the pilots hugging the terrain to avoid radar lock. But inside the cabin, the chaotic energy of the extraction had collapsed into a heavy, suffocating stillness. Elara sat huddled on the bench seat, her knees pulled up slightly to relieve the pressure on her sprained ankle. The adrenaline that had fueled her, that had allowed her to scale vertical shafts, calculate refraction indices in milliseconds, and kill men with a knife, was evaporating. In its place came the crash. It hit her like a physical blow. Her hands began to shake, a violent, uncontrollable tremor that rattled the buckles on her chest rig. Her teeth chattered. The pain in her lower back, where the sink had cracked against her spine, flared into a dull, nausea-inducing throb. The cut on her arm burned under the dried blood and sleeve fabric. She looked down at her hands. They were black with carbon, gray with dust, and stained dark red with blood that wasn't hers. She tried to wipe them on her trousers, but the fabric was just as filthy. Across from her, the men of Alpha Platoon were conducting their own post-action rituals. They were checking each other for wounds, reloading weapons out of habit, drinking water. Miller, the massive operator who had mocked her size in the locker room, was staring at her. He had a bandage on his deltoid where a graze had torn through his uniform. He caught her eye. He didn't look away. He didn't smirk. He looked at the ruined suppressor on the stolen HK-416 sitting next to her boots. The metal twisted and melted like wax. Then he looked at her face. He nodded. A single, slow dip of his chin. It was an apology. It was an acknowledgement. "I see you." Elara didn't nod back. She didn't have the energy. She just stared at a rivet on the floor, trying to keep the contents of her stomach down. A shadow fell over her. Master. Chief Rogan unbuckled his harness and leaned across the aisle. In the red cabin light, he looked like a demon. Face painted with camouflage, eyes rimmed with exhaustion. He held out a plastic water bottle. Elara stared at it. Her throat was sandpaper. She remembered the moment in the shaft, hours ago, when she had cut her own hydration bladder loose to survive the climb. She hadn't had a sip of water since infiltration. She reached out with a trembling hand and took the bottle. Their gloved fingers brushed. "You good, Vance?" Rogan asked. His voice was low, barely audible over the rotor whine, stripped of the barking command tone he used in the field. Elara unscrewed the cap and took a long, desperate drink. The water was warm and tasted of plastic, but it was the best thing she had ever consumed. She lowered the bottle, gasping. "I lost my rifle," she said, her voice cracking. "The SR-25. I left it in the bathroom." It was a stupid thing to say. Men had died. She had killed. And she was worried about a serialized piece of government property. Rogan looked at her. For a second, she thought he would reprimand her for losing sensitive gear. "We left a lot of things back there," Rogan said quietly. He leaned back, resting his head against the fuselage wall. "Equipment is replaceable. Operators aren't." Operators. He hadn't called her Pixie. He hadn't called her Specialist. He hadn't called her the Mascot. He had grouped her in with them. "You cleared the board, Vance," Rogan continued, his eyes closed. "That shot through the skylight. I've never seen ballistics work like that. I don't know how you did it." "Geometry," Elara whispered. "It's just math." "Yeah," Rogan grunted. "Well, your math saved my team, so thank you." The words hung in the air between them. In the special operations community, Gratitude was rarely spoken. It was usually paid in beers or covered shifts. To hear it said aloud, directly, from a Master Chief, was a medal in itself. Elara looked around the cabin. Davis was asleep, head lolling on his chest. Miller was cleaning his knife. They were battered, dirty, and alive. Because she had fit where they couldn't. Because she was small. She touched the bruise on her face where the dumpster lid had hit her. She felt the grime on her skin. She didn't feel like a child anymore. She didn't feel like a prodigy. She felt old. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom. 10 mics to Copperhead. Whiskey on the rocks. Elara leaned her head back against the vibrating metal wall. The mascot had died in that factory, buried under the rubble of the command center. The woman sitting on this helicopter was something else entirely. She was dangerous. She was capable. And she was tired. She closed her eyes, letting the darkness take her, lulled by the rhythmic thumping of the rotors. She didn't need to open them to know that when they landed, no one would ever laugh at her size again.